Hey, Bible lovers, Tim Nichols here, and we are introducing a new series called More Than a Nickel's Worth. And in this next session, we deal with the nature of translation philosophy and how far is too far one way or the other, to the literal side and to the paraphrase side. I think you're really going to enjoy this. So anyhow, God bless you. How far is too far? Because we talked about going from one end of the spectrum to the other. When do you think we run into some trouble? Do you think a paraphrase is too far, or do you think paraphrases are useful? Do you think that, because I think it was Tim that mentioned sometimes it's very difficult to take the Hebrew and the English, or even the Greek and the English, and get them to translate directly and make sense or be accurate. It always cracks me up when we have these polls on these Bible groups, which is the most accurate translation, and most people there have no idea what they're talking about. I would be included in that. I have no idea what the most accurate translation is. I have to choose to trust the scholars and trust those that have done the work. And I also have people around me that I ask questions. I ask Jonathan questions all the time about the Greek. I had a Hebrew scholar that attended our church, recently passed away, that I would always ask about the Hebrew. So what are your thoughts? How close should we keep it to the line of word for word? And when does that stop being beneficial? And how close should we keep it to the line of paraphrase? And when does that stop being beneficial? Father Jonathan, we'll start with you.
So I think that it depends on the context and the purpose. I think that certainly when I'm communicating the scriptures to younger people, to people that are new in the faith, I am more inclined to say sometimes it's okay to have a paraphrase, maybe not a full paraphrase, but something like the NLT is really great. It's okay to do that. I think the NLT is balanced a little bit more because it is produced by scholars. It's not just a random paraphrase by a single person or something like that. There was a lot of scholarship that went into it. It's an offshoot of the original Living Bible. And so there's been a lot of work to produce something that's quality, scholarly, but is also very readable and understandable. And so I think that end of the spectrum is okay. And then at the other end of the spectrum, if you really want to go deep, it's important to have this, very literal translation that will go word for word. And some people complain, well, that makes it difficult for us to understand because sometimes the grammar doesn't match up. And for me, where I can read the Greek, and I have a little bit of a Hebrew background, but mostly Greek, for me, it's not as much of an issue because I can read sentences using that grammar, even in English. It doesn't sound foreign to my ears, but for other people, it might. And one of the things that I've seen lately on the Bible groups is a real love for the Berean style study Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not terribly familiar with the translation itself. I've looked at it a little bit, but one of the things I liked about it is the same group of people have translated 4 tiers of translation. There's a interlinear, there's a literal, the study Bible, which is just a reading Bible kind of thing, and then there's the amplified or something like that, where it's like added emphasis, not quite a paraphrase, but there's emphasis added, and the whole suite, because it's the same group of people that's doing it, you'll find a consistency there. And I thought that was interesting, an interesting way about doing it. Now, the other thing that I come from a tradition where some of our greatest preachers were preaching in Greek, and I will read them also in the original Greek. And they were not opposed to paraphrasing, because for them, they were trying to communicate the gospel in the language that they spoke. And if they felt comfortable taking the Greek and then saying it in a different way in Greek, even though they would at times quote, they would also paraphrase and be paraphrastic in certain ways about the text. Mm-hmm. We do the same thing when we communicate the gospel. And so I think that as long as we're balanced and we recognize that if we're going to make a theological claim, we ought to be sure that it's what the text actually says. We're not using supplied words to make, linchpin points or something like that. And we want to make sure that we're really saying what the scriptures are saying. I think being a little bit paraphrastic in our explanation, in our reading, as long as it gets people familiar with the story, especially, mm-hmm. like a paraphrase or a more dynamic equivalent translation might be helpful for really getting the story of scripture into someone's heart. And then from there, we can start to plant seeds and cultivate a deeper awareness of what the scriptural text might say. So it's a spectrum, and also it's intentionality, purpose, aim, goal, all of these things, why it's being used, and not to go too far to either extreme.
Right. And I think you talking about the supplied words as well, that is where the King James and I believe the NASB, I'm not sure how many other
The
translations
King
do that, but
James,
they
yeah.
make the supplied words very clear. And I think that's very important because I don't believe the ESV does that. And the CSB doesn't do that. So unless you know, you don't know which words are supplied. And I could definitely see that leading to some confusion. So, Tim, what's your perspective on this? How how far is too far one way or the other on the
Well,
word for word
the
paraphrase?
way I would put it is that on the literal side, you have the problem of misunderstanding, and on the dynamic side, you have the problem of misrepresenting.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So misunderstanding and misrepresenting are the two extremes. And so I think this is where a lot of people don't realize. They think the more literal, the better. But that's not always true.
Right.
You know,
Right.
if actually, even today, if you were going from one language to another in Spanish, for example, or some other language today, you would actually want someone in another language to change the wording up enough to make sure that what you're saying is clear and understandable in that receptor language.
Mm-hmm.
So see, if you're overly literal, it could be misunderstood. And I think there are things in the Bible that translators have always said, yeah, we need to make sure we change this enough so that it's understood in English. So, you know, no Bible is really as literal as it can possibly be. You know, unless it's a, you know, interlinear or something that's
Right.
called a literal translation. But even if it's called literal, again, languages don't match up word for word. That's a misunderstanding people have. You know, one word in English, even a word like love, we have different connotations for love in English that probably don't match another language. I might even say, I love ice cream, but I don't know that I'd want to put that literally into French. I'm not sure, but I'm sure there's a language out there that would probably be misunderstood.
Right.
So there's the misunderstanding, and then the misrepresentation. When you get into this whole idea of we need to take the biblical text and make it understandable, while I'm all for that, it's easy to start misrepresenting either the message or not being transparent about the interpretation you're doing in between the original text and what the audience is receiving. And that's where italicized words, that's just a way to be very transparent about if you're adding some supplied words. But, you know, as long as a translation is trying to accurately represent the original language, I can be pretty open-minded. But I have to say, I think when we get into the paraphrases, I just find there are various cases where I can find, yeah, that doesn't, I just don't really believe that's what the author really intended. I think that's a misrepresentation. And, you know, so I think for me, I want to stay more to that literal side.
Right.
That's just my approach. And I wish, again, that's where my two-pronged approach could be helpful to people. Even if you're going to use something a little looser, more dynamic, good to have a more literal translation along with that.
Right.
And that'll just help you to make sure that even though you're trying to understand it, you know that it's not being misrepresented.
Yes. And I have actually read the Passion Translation, and it definitely seems to have a theological bias. And that is the danger you get into when you move into that paraphrase side, is that it can be interpreted for you. And I feel that happens in the Passion Translation. For example, in the Gospel of Luke, they list the genealogy as the genealogy of Mary. Now, that could very well be true, but it is not stated in the scripture that's the genealogy of Mary. So we can't say with absolute certainty that that's the case. Now, I happen to believe that it is the genealogy of Mary. It's just my personal opinion, but I could be wrong. And to infer that in the writing of the scripture itself, I believe that's a dangerous practice. We need to let the word speak for itself. The biggest issue I have with those that go closer to the paraphrases is the poetry. There's one, I think, in the book of Job, I can't remember which one it is. They're calling each other a blowhard. And I'm like, you know, I don't think that's what that word means. Now, you get it, right? You get that they're trying to insult each other, and you understand that's what's going on. But I would much rather know what it actually says. And you know what? That's why we have pastors. That's why we have scholars. That's why we have teachers. And that's why we have leaders in the church to kind of help us in these areas that we get stuck. And at least if that preacher is in error, then that preacher is in error by himself. You know, if a translation's in error, then it's leading an entire group of people to error. So I am with both of you. I definitely think that you need to lean more toward the word for word side. But again, there is no such thing as a literal translation. I actually have one. It's an interlinear, but it's a hot mess to try to read. It's not in order, and every now and then they'll give you 2 or 3 word options where it could be this, this, or this, and it's just not really helpful. It's a battle. So when it comes to straight reading, I really do believe that the literal approach, as much as possible, is the best. And I think the key balance there is, I really wish all translations would emphasize, bold, italicize, or do something to make certain that the words that are supplied, hey, we put this in here for clarity. It's not in the original language. And I also think that the textual footnotes are invaluable in this, to where, you know, even in the NLT, when it'll take it as far as like, whoa, this is really, because there's some places in the NLT that I read, and it's like, man, I'm not comfortable with this. But then the footnotes will kind of clarify, well, this more traditionally, it's like this. And I think, so supplied words being italicized or made clear, that's my knock against the CSB. I love the CSB, but it is difficult to know which words are supplied unless you know. And then your textual footnotes, I believe as many of those that can be supplied as possible is, I think, important in order to be able to understand, okay, this is what this is saying, but this is also another option that it could mean. And I also think those textual footnotes, which is something we'll get into in a minute with the textual criticism, can really lend to some struggles with some people over these quote unquote missing verses. So we'll get into that in the next segment. So anybody else have anything to add to this?
No.
I guess I would just say, as far as italics, I tend to be a little bit more dual approached about that. I think the disadvantage of italics is that a lot of people don't even know what those mean, to be honest. If
Right.
a person picks up a Bible, they're actually going to say, like I said when I was little, oh, maybe these are words that you're supposed to emphasize when you're reading. So that's kind of the opposite of the effect you want. And really, but the other thing is, I actually think, you know, it can give the impression that those words are the ones that don't count as much. But sometimes supplied words are just necessary to go from one language to another. They're not. So I'm not hard line about that. I'm kind of with you, though. I think there's a place for some translations to have them. Again, those would be the very literal translations. But I think it's kind of nice for readability for a lot of average people to have a translation that doesn't clutter the text and become more confusing with things like italicized words. So that's the only thing I would personally add to that.
And in a context like this, where it's 3 people who preach and teach and study, you're talking a different game than someone that's just reading the Bible for the purpose of reading the Bible. So obviously our answers are going to vary from the common. So I would say you probably have the correct perspective on that from most people's point of view, is readability over scholarly approach and understanding how each thing is done. And for me, that's very important, because I want to know what words are supplied. You know, I want to know what which verses are missing in certain textual sources, and which ones are maybe disputed in their meaning. And like Selah, what does that word mean? And there are several footnotes that you'll see where it says meaning uncertain, but they put a word there. So, you know, my guess is generally they're using context, like a maskil. What's a maskil? They don't know, but they're assuming it's some type of song written to music. So there are some assumptions made, just like Selah, they assume that it's some sort of pause, because contextually that seems to be what it does. That seems to be its function. So anyhow, this is definitely interesting stuff. And in the next segment, we are going to be talking about translation and critical text and the role that they play. So thank you so much for watching the episode where we talk about translation philosophy and how far is too far one way or the other. In the next session, of course, we're going to be dealing with textual criticism. So we look forward to seeing you in that one, and make sure you tune in. God bless. And meanwhile, keep calm. Jesus on.